Hi, I am Ashutosh Bhardwaj. Outlook's this week's issue focuses on federalism. We have with us Yamini Aiyar, the president of Center for Policy Research and a very fine scholar of Indian political system. So Yamini, over to you. We know what's happening, but why is it happening? What are its roots?
Well, I think it's important when we talk about federalism to look back at the constitutional design for federalism in India. Scholars of federalism have pointed out that India's brand of federalism was quite unique in that it offered far stronger powers to the union government or the central government than most other federal polities across the globe. And this was largely on account of the fact that the Indian constitution was framed against the backdrop of partition, recognizing the imperatives of nation building on the one hand and democratic consolidation on the other. So in their wisdom, our founding fathers felt that the path towards nation building required the presence of a strong center. But they also recognized that the diversity of India, its linguistic diversity, ethnic diversity, regional diversity, religious diversity, required the constitution to have an accommodative element to it as well. So you saw the constitution enabling for some spaces for unique provisions given for what political scientists call asymmetric federalism. We saw that in the form of the now abrogated Article 370. And in addition, the intergovernmental relationship was designed in such a way that there was a deep dependence or interdependence between state and center. So the center acquired stronger powers for revenue collection, while the states had the bulk of responsibility or have the bulk of responsibility for expenditure. So in a sense, states are dependent on the center for financial resources, but the center is dependent on states for achieving national goals. So it is in this sort of relationship of a strong center with space for political accommodation and interdependence between center and state that India's federalism is structured. Now, because of this, on the one hand, it has allowed India to have the ability to accommodate for assertions of identity, and in that sense contributed in no small measure to our democratic consolidation. So our founding fathers really did think long term that the center can actually redraw state boundaries. No other federal polity or fully federal polity has these kinds of strong powers at the center. The center can impose its will through presidential rule. Of course, it's been misused politically, but it did allow that accommodation. At the same time, it created the space for politics to shape the everyday practice of federalism. So when politics was more accommodative, you saw a far deeper form of federalism, most visible in the promise of federalism of the early 1990s through till 2014, that coalition era that we confronted. And when you have single party majority, the opportunity for political centralization is ripe. So in a sense, the constitutional design both created a context for greater federal accommodation, but potential for greater political centralization. And it is in that context that we are seeing single party majority using this space to move towards a deeper political centralization. After all, the BJP doesn't necessarily, in its ideological framing, have that much patience for accommodating multiple identities.
So in a way, if a party which has got a brutal majority, if it wishes, it can very well turn the constitution and the political system to meet its requirement and to turn the system into an unitarian one.
It has the potential to do so, and as we're seeing, it is doing so to a degree. Politics also plays its own checks and balances. So I think the bigger challenge to federalism perhaps comes from the fact that there is at some level a deep commitment to the idea of federalism or protection of state rights in some ways. So state political parties and the sort of variation that you see in our politics, which was very much part of the story of the 1990s to 2000s, creates a kind of political opposition to centralization. But both state politics and national politics also has an inherent culture of political centralization in the following way. At one level, there is very little inner party democracy, and political centralizing of authority within the nature of political parties is part and parcel of our politics. So even in the great heydays of federalism of the 90s and 2000s, it was chief ministers that became sort of regional satraps, and they sort of accumulated power within their chief ministerial framework, and the chief minister's office is where you go when you want anything done. Still, even today, the chief minister's office is where you go. And credit for what the political party went to the electorate for was essentially drawn on to by the political leadership. It's the same model at the center. What happens in the presence of a single party majority is that at the national level, there's less pull and pressure to oppose that kind of political centralization. And you saw that in the 2019 elections for all the welfare sweep, from Ujjwala to Swachh Bharat, a very interesting reversal compared to the coalition era, where Prime Minister Modi himself directly was able to claim electoral credit for these programs. Earlier, it was the state governments that used to be able to take credit. So that has changed quite a bit. But state governments have been pretty quick to recognize this, right? So they themselves now have their own schemes. I just read today that Maharashtra is now not going to implement or looking to create an alternative scheme to the Pradhan Mantri Bima Yojana for crop insurance. So it's creating its own kinds of pressures there. Yet at the same time, because of this tendency to centralize, which is inherent in our politics, when the centralizing authority is using the powers of the Constitution to further aggregate powers, often you don't get a robust enough opposition. And the best example of that was in the fact that in Parliament, when Article 370 was abrogated, we essentially turned the Constitution on its head by converting a full functional state into a union territory. There was absolutely no political opposition for that from state governments. And ironically, cut to a year and a half later, the similar process has been followed in dealing with the national NCT of Delhi, when the powers have been taken away from the chief minister and placed back onto the LG.
So when you underline the importance of powerful CMs during the coalition era, it reminded of what Ajit Jogi, the former Chhattisgarh CM, once told me. There are only 3 power centers in India, he said. DM, CM and PM. So I'm sure that others have also said so. So this is very fascinating, that how the entire political and constitutional structure is eventually all about the confrontation and tussle between these power centers, and which is not happening, as you're saying. The opposition is not as strong. If we continue in this direction, say for another 2 years or maybe 7 years, if the BJP wins 2024 as well, where do you see India's constitution and federalist structure then?
Well, I think the biggest threat to federalism is also the biggest threat to democracy. If we do not have a space for accommodation of multiple identities, then we do not have a robust democracy, and certainly we do not have a robust federalism. So for me, federalism and democracy are very closely intertwined. The less patience we have with the accommodative spirit of federalism, the greater challenge we have with the ability to enable this country to cohere, or democracy to flourish in this country. And there can be 2 potential outcomes. On the one hand, we could potentially walk the path of a completely unitary state. And I simply don't see that happening, because we do have multiple subnational identities, and those identities need to be accommodated. Thus far, that federal accommodation has ensured that those subnational identities get played out within the borders of states. And whenever it asserts itself outside of that, there is some possibility of accommodation. When you express impatience with this, or a lack of interest in this, when everything is about one nation, you don't have that accommodative spirit. And that could either, in an extreme level, and I don't anticipate that, but in an extreme level, it could convert itself into a move for consistent violence, because that lack of space for accommodation of identity will find itself to play out. After all, India is still negotiating a lot of its multiplicity of identities. Or it will, or in an even more extreme scenario, it may end up in creating an environment for secessionist movements. We've had that history in the past. That's not the history that we are looking for. We should be looking forward towards a deeper federal compromise, not a more fragmented federalism.
I have a related question. If we have regional leaders, that is our CM, say Mamata Banerjee or say Chhattisgarh CM, if we have such chief ministers who are as centralized in their administration, who are as less accommodative of the Adivasi concern or the other issues in their state, how can we expect that somewhere a government at the center would be able to accommodate, whereas the states continue to play their authoritarian or unitarian rule?
Well, of course there is, and in some funny way, that is precisely what the founding fathers had anticipated. That is why strong central authority enabled the center to interfere in matters which ordinarily ought not to have been, in other federal contexts, matters that the center could intervene in. It is, in fact, it's really ironic that when we have a chief minister as a prime minister, what were the first 2 years of the NDA government about? They were about a narrative of cooperative federalism, of competitive federalism, when in the fiscal dimension, when the 14th Finance Commission, which was undergoing its deliberations when Prime Minister Modi was still Chief Minister Modi, he was one of the loudest advocates for states' rights for greater devolution. In fact, he argued that if I'm right, it shouldn't be 42%, it should be 50%, pushing very hard for states to have greater access to resources, to do what states are meant to do constitutionally, which is clearly defined in the Constitution, that states have a larger set of responsibilities towards a larger set of expenditure responsibilities. And the dismantling of the Planning Commission, the setting up of the Niti Aayog, the acceptance of the 14th Finance Commission recommendations for deeper devolution. In its own way, the creation of the GST, and specifically the GST Council as a new deliberative fora for state-center dialogue, all of those were indicators that perhaps, at least in the fiscal and administrative side, we were heading in the direction of deeper, cooperative, genuinely interdependent federalism. But chief ministers operate through centralized politics, and I think that form of administration also became very visible in how the central government or union government was functioning. And over time, that narrative of cooperative federalism has completely given way to a far more centralized form of administration and form of fiscal federalism as well, despite the 15th Finance Commission's commitment to keeping to those devolution targets as set by the 14th Finance Commission. So, for instance, central government has taken to the practice of imposing cesses and surcharges, which are not shareable with states, in order to be able to sort of sequester resources for itself. And even though the Finance Commission requires 40% of devolution to states as a percentage of gross tax revenue, it's only been about 30 to 33% over actually pre-14th and 15th Finance Commission time. So when the center isn't a champion, when the union government, I should correct myself, is not a champion of federalism, you don't have the political or the moral authority to interfere in state forms of central authoritarianism and centralization. In fact, it's a collective political culture, what Pratap Bhanu Mehta has sort of described once in one of his op-eds as flexible federalism, federalism that's a convenient federalism, a contingent federalism. And I think that's the big challenge for India. How do we move from a contingent federalism to a principled federalism?
Thank you so much, Yamini.
Thank you.
Thank you.